Before the rain ever fell, something else had already happened. Genesis 6 does not begin with water. It begins with a breach, a boundary crossed, a line blurred, a world quietly rewritten. Most people think the Great Flood was about wickedness, about violence spreading across the earth. But buried in the opening lines is a detail so strange that for centuries readers avoided it. It suggests humanity was no longer entirely human, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but structurally. If the foundation of creation was being altered, if identity itself was becoming unstable, then perhaps the flood was not punishment. Perhaps it was containment. Tonight, we look at the verse that changes everything. Welcome to Hidden Origins, where ancient mysteries are examined with calm precision. Let's go deeper. Genesis 6 opens with a statement that feels almost administrative. Human beings began to multiply on the face of the earth. It sounds harmless: growth, expansion, civilization unfolding. But immediately the tone shifts. It speaks of sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives. From this union came the Nephilim, the mighty men of old. It is only a few lines, yet those lines disrupt the entire structure of the story. The text does not explain who these beings are. It does not define the mechanics. It does not clarify intention. It simply records that something crossed into human space. And after that, everything accelerates. Violence increases, corruption spreads, the earth becomes filled. That word, filled, is critical. In Hebrew, it suggests saturation, overflow, a system beyond capacity. Now here's what makes this passage unsettling. The narrative places the strange union before the moral collapse, not after. The breach precedes the chaos, which raises a profound question. Was the violence the cause of the flood, or a symptom of something deeper? Ancient Jewish traditions interpreted the sons of God as rebellious divine beings. Early Christian writers echoed that idea. Other interpretations argue they were powerful rulers, tyrants, or dynasties intermarrying with common people. But regardless of interpretation, the narrative pattern remains consistent. Boundary violation equals unnatural offspring equals systemic corruption. The text does not describe ordinary sin. It describes structural instability. And then comes a haunting sentence: "My spirit shall not strive with man forever." This is not thunder. It is not fury. It sounds like withdrawal, as if something sacred is retreating from something altered. If humanity was created in the image of God, bearing divine imprint, then what happens if that image becomes diluted? If the flood was meant to reset creation, we must ask, reset from what? Not just moral failure, but ontological confusion. Genesis 1 presents a carefully ordered cosmos, separation between light and darkness, sea and land, heaven and earth. Genesis 6 shows those separations collapsing. Divine and human, power and flesh, violence and dominance. Creation was designed with boundaries. The pre-flood world seems defined by their erosion, and erosion, once begun, spreads quietly. Civilizations do not collapse overnight. They destabilize first. Identity blurs, authority corrupts, power concentrates. The Nephilim are described as mighty men, heroes, renowned figures. But power combined with instability becomes something dangerous. especially in a young world still forming its identity. The flood narrative that follows is often interpreted as divine judgment. But consider another lens. If creation itself was under threat, if the human blueprint was being altered, then intervention would not be punishment, it would be preservation. Noah is described as blameless in his generations. That phrase is unusual, not merely morally upright, but uncorrupted, as if lineage matters, as if continuity matters, as if something had to be carried forward intact. The ark, then, becomes more than a boat. It becomes a vessel of genetic continuity, cultural reset, structural restoration. The strange verse at the beginning of Genesis 6 reframes everything. The flood may not begin with rain. It may begin with a fracture in reality. And fractures left untreated spread. We explore how ancient civilizations outside the Bible remembered this same breach and why nearly every flood myth includes hybrid beings, divine rebellion, and a world that had gone too far. If this perspective challenges what you thought you knew, subscribe now, because we are only at the surface. The strange passage in Genesis 6 is not alone. Across the ancient world, in Mesopotamia, in early Jewish writings, in fragments preserved through oral tradition, we find echoes of the same pattern. Divine beings descend, boundaries blur, hybrid figures emerge, and then the world is washed away. This pattern appears too consistently to dismiss as coincidence. In Mesopotamian literature, long before the Hebrew text was compiled in its final form, stories circulated about semi-divine rulers who possessed extraordinary knowledge. They were described as culture bringers, teachers of metallurgy, astronomy, warfare, enchantment. They advanced civilization, but they also destabilized it. The Sumerian king list speaks of rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods before a catastrophic flood ended their age. The Epic of Gilgamesh remembers giants and legendary heroes who were two-thirds divine. The Akkadian Atarahis epic describes humanity becoming noisy, overgrown, disruptive, until the gods decide to reduce their number through disaster. Different cultures, different languages, yet a similar memory, a world that crossed a threshold. Now, pause here. When ancient societies describe divine-human intermingling, they are not necessarily discussing biology in modern scientific terms. They are describing transgression at the highest level, power entering human systems without restraint. In many of these stories, the beings who descended were not merely observers, they were instructors, and instruction can reshape destiny. Some Second Temple Jewish writings, particularly the Book of Enoch, expand dramatically on Genesis 6. They speak of watchers who descended to earth and revealed forbidden knowledge, weapon-making, cosmetics, sorcery, celestial secrets. The issue was not romance, it was acceleration. Humanity was evolving, but perhaps too quickly. Technology without maturity, power without structure, knowledge without restraint. Notice how contemporary that feels. In Genesis, the text is restrained. It gives no detail about what the Nephilim did, only that they were mighty, renowned, powerful, and that afterward, violence filled the earth. It does not say the hybrids were violent. It says violence saturated the world. That distinction matters. When boundaries collapse, systems destabilize. When hierarchies distort, power centralizes. When knowledge outruns wisdom, imbalance spreads. Genesis 6 does not describe petty wrongdoing. It describes systemic corruption. The Hebrew word often translated as corrupt can also imply ruin, decay, destruction from within. It is architectural language, structural. Creation was built with separations, sky from sea, sea from land, species according to kind. Genesis 6 implies a violation of according to kind. And in ancient cosmology, kinds were sacred categories. To cross them was to undo order itself. Now consider the narrative pacing. The strange union is mentioned. Then comes the limitation of lifespan, 120 years. Then comes the statement of corruption. Then comes divine grief. Grief. The text says God regretted making humanity and was grieved in his heart. This is not theatrical anger, it is sorrow. Why sorrow? Because something had gone wrong at a foundational level.
The flood, then, can be read as a cosmic reboot, not erasing existence, but protecting its blueprint. Noah is described not only as righteous, but as walking with God, echoing Enoch before him, a preserved lineage, a preserved pattern. If Genesis 6 is about containment, then the ark is containment technology. It carries forward what remains intact, and every flood myth that follows, whether Babylonian, Greek, or Near Eastern, includes one consistent detail: a chosen survivor, one thread preserved. Why? Because even in catastrophe, continuity matters. The question is not whether ancient people believed in literal giants. The question is what they were trying to explain. Perhaps they were describing a world where power had become distorted beyond recognition, a world where identity, authority, and hierarchy collapsed into chaos, a world that required radical reset. And here is where tension deepens. If the pre-flood crisis was about altered boundaries and unstable identity, then Genesis is not merely history, it is warning. We confront the psychological dimension of this story. What happens to a civilization when it forgets what it is, and why the flood narrative may be less about water and more about memory? If this exploration is expanding your perspective, subscribe, because the deepest layer is still ahead. If Genesis 6 is describing more than violence, if it is describing a collapse of identity, then the flood narrative becomes psychological before it becomes geological. Civilizations rarely fall because of a single event. They fall when they forget what they are. The pre-flood world, as portrayed in the text, was technologically advanced enough to build cities, forge tools, organize societies. It was not primitive, it was sophisticated. But sophistication without moral architecture creates instability. Genesis places unusual emphasis on a phrase: every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil continually. Notice the wording, not just actions, inclinations, patterns of thought. This is cognitive corruption. When identity blurs, behavior follows. When boundaries dissolve, meaning dissolves with them. If humanity was created to reflect something divine, to carry an image, then the crisis of Genesis 6 is not merely violence, it is distortion of the image itself. In psychological terms, identity is the anchor of behavior. Remove the anchor, and action drifts. The text suggests that whatever occurred in those early verses did more than produce legendary figures. It shifted the human self-understanding. Who are we? What are we becoming? What defines us? These questions echo beneath the surface of the chapter. Ancient writers may not have used modern terminology, but they understood a profound principle.
When categories collapse, chaos multiplies. Genesis 1 is structured around separation, light from darkness, waters above from waters below, land from sea. Order emerges through distinction. Genesis 6 portrays the undoing of distinction. Divine and human intermingle. Power centralizes. Violence fills the earth. The earth is described as corrupted in its sight. This phrase implies self-awareness. The world could see its own decay. That is perhaps the most unsettling detail. Corruption was not hidden, it was normalized, and normalization is the final stage of collapse. When instability becomes ordinary, reform becomes impossible.
This is where Noah enters the narrative, not as a hero of spectacle, but as a stabilizing point. He is described as righteous in his generation. In Hebrew thought, generation can imply lineage, continuity, pattern. Noah represents intactness, a preserved template in a destabilized system. This shifts how we interpret the ark. The ark is not simply survival technology. It is preservation architecture. Measurements are given, proportions specified, structure emphasized. Order inside the vessel contrasts with chaos outside. Waters in Genesis are symbols of disorder, the primordial deep from which creation was first formed. When the flood comes, it is as if creation temporarily returns to pre-Genesis state. The boundaries dissolve again. Waters above and below reunite. The world unforms. But here is the tension. If the flood resets creation, what prevents it from happening again? The covenant with Noah answers that question, but the psychological layer remains. The narrative suggests that instability begins not in the sky, but in the heart. If the Sons of God passage symbolizes power without boundary, then the violence that follows is predictable. When strength is detached from responsibility, domination replaces stewardship. When knowledge outruns wisdom, acceleration replaces growth. Genesis 6 can be read as a meditation on unchecked escalation. Something entered the system that humanity was not prepared to integrate. Whether literal beings, mythic memory, or symbolic warning, the effect is the same. Humanity exceeded its design. And when design is exceeded, correction follows. But correction in Genesis is not annihilation, it is filtration. Only what aligns with original intent is carried forward. That is why the narrative emphasizes covenant after catastrophe. The rainbow is not a decorative symbol, it is a structural promise. Order will not again be undone through water. But water was never the deepest issue. The deepest issue was identity. And this is where the story becomes unsettlingly relevant, because civilizations today also struggle with boundary erosion, acceleration of knowledge, centralization of power, and instability of self-definition. Genesis 6 does not scream, it observes. It records a world that drifted beyond its blueprint, and drift, left uncorrected, becomes disaster. We step back and ask the final question: was the flood a divine reaction or a necessary restoration of cosmic order? If this investigation is reshaping how you see one of the oldest stories ever told, subscribe, because the conclusion reframes everything. When the rain finally stops in Genesis, something unusual happens. The narrative slows down. There is no triumphant tone, no celebration, no dramatic proclamation of victory. Instead, there is silence,
then a resting. The ark settles on the mountains of Ararat. The waters gradually withdraw. The earth dries. It feels less like survival and more like recalibration. If Genesis 6 described a collapse of boundaries, Genesis 8 and 9 describe their restoration. Waters return to their place, land reappears, distinction is reestablished. Creation begins again, not from nothing, but from preservation. This is why the flood story cannot be reduced to punishment alone. Punishment ends with destruction. Restoration continues beyond it. And what follows the flood is not domination, but covenant. God establishes an agreement not just with Noah, but with all living creatures. The language expands outward, humanity, animals, generations to come. The promise is structural, never again. The rainbow becomes a sign, not merely of mercy, but of stabilized order, a visible reminder that cosmic boundaries will hold. But here is the deeper layer. If the pre-flood crisis was about identity distortion and boundary erosion, then the covenant is not only about weather patterns, it is about continuity of design. After the flood, humanity is given responsibility again, stewardship, multiplication, governance of the earth. But there is also a subtle recalibration. Lifespan is shortened, limitations are reinforced, constraints return. Why? Because limitation protects structure. Genesis presents an uncomfortable but enduring principle. Power must remain bounded. The strange verse in Genesis 6, the one about the sons of God and the daughters of men, may never be fully decoded. Scholars will continue to debate its literal meaning, its symbolic layer, its mythic echoes. But its narrative function is clear. It marks the moment when boundaries dissolved. Everything that follows, violence, grief, flood, unfolds from that instability. And everything after the flood works to restore separation, order, distinction. The Bible begins with separation creating life. It shows collapse through fusion, and it restores through re-separation. That pattern is theological, but it is also psychological and civilizational. Societies thrive when roles are clear, when power is accountable, when identity is coherent. They destabilize when categories blur without wisdom, when strength outruns character, when knowledge exceeds moral capacity. Genesis 6 is not obsessed with giants. It is concerned with imbalance. The Nephilim, whether literal hybrids or symbolic representations of corrupted power, embody what happens when might detaches from design. And the flood becomes the narrative language of reset. But notice something critical. After the flood, humanity is still imperfect. Violence does not disappear forever. Conflict returns. Pride resurfaces in Babel. The flood did not eliminate human weakness. It preserved human possibility. That distinction matters. The story is not about erasing failure. It is about protecting the framework within which growth remains possible. In that sense, the Great Flood becomes less about destruction and more about preservation of potential. The forbidden verse at the beginning of Genesis 6 forces readers to confront a difficult question. What happens when humanity stops honoring its boundaries? The answer in the narrative is not immediate lightning. It is gradual destabilization. And when destabilization reaches saturation, intervention follows. Not to erase existence, but to safeguard its blueprint. The ancient world remembered this story not because of water, but because of warning. Not fear-based warning, structural warning. Order is fragile. Identity is foundational. Boundaries are not restrictions, they are architecture. Genesis 6 whispers this truth quietly before the storm ever begins. And perhaps that is why the verse feels unsettling, because it suggests that catastrophe rarely starts with rain, it starts with erosion. If this journey through the hidden layers of Genesis has expanded your perspective, subscribe to Hidden Origins, where ancient texts are explored with depth, clarity, and respect for their complexity. The deeper you look, the more the origins reveal.